Have you ever wondered what they really taught you in history class about Africa? They probably mentioned the civilizing mission, the idea that Europe went to Africa to bring progress, religion, and modernity. But what if I told you that was just a convenient story, a carefully constructed narrative to hide a much harsher, more calculated truth? The real reasons Europe scrambled for Africa weren't about civilization. They were about something far more primal and profitable. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of that official story and expose the raw, unfiltered truth behind the colonization of an entire continent. Get ready, because what you're about to hear might change everything you thought you knew. Let's start with the most obvious and glittering prize: gold. For centuries, Africa was known to the world as a land of immense wealth. Empires like Mali and Ghana were legendary for their vast reserves of gold. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, made a pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, and his caravan was so laden with gold that his spending devalued the metal in Egypt for over a decade. This wasn't a myth. It was a well-documented reality that made European monarchs and merchants drool with envy. When they finally had the technological means to penetrate the African interior, finding and controlling these sources of gold was priority number one. They weren't just looking for a few nuggets. They were looking to seize the entire source of wealth that had powered African empires for centuries. But gold was just the beginning. As the Industrial Revolution roared to life in Europe, factories were hungry. They needed raw materials, and Africa was a treasure trove. Rubber from the Congo, essential for tires and industrial machinery. Cotton from Egypt and Sudan to feed the textile mills of Manchester. Palm oil from West Africa, used for everything from lubricants to soap. Cocoa, diamonds, copper, tin. The list is endless. Africa was seen as a giant, open-air warehouse, ready to be plundered to fuel Europe's industrial growth. The so-called civilizing mission was, in reality, a mission to secure an uninterrupted, cheap supply of the raw materials that Europe's economy now depended on. This wasn't trade. It was a systematic extraction of wealth on an unprecedented scale. Then came the discovery of black gold, oil. In the early 20th century, as the world began to run on internal combustion engines, the strategic importance of oil skyrocketed. Prospectors fanned out across the globe, and Africa did not disappoint. Significant oil reserves were found in places like Nigeria, Angola, and Libya. Controlling these resources became a new imperial imperative. Having access to oil meant having power, military power, economic power, and political power. The European powers weren't just thinking about the present, they were playing a long-term geopolitical game. Securing African oil fields meant securing their future dominance on the world stage. The fate of millions of Africans was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all, to the strategic value of the black liquid bubbling beneath their feet. Beyond what was under the ground, Europe coveted the ground itself. Africa is a vast continent with incredibly fertile land. The colonizers saw this land not as the ancestral home of millions, but as potential plantations. Huge swaths of the most productive land were seized from local populations and converted into cash crop farms. Coffee in Kenya, tea in Uganda, peanuts in Senegal. These crops weren't grown to feed Africans. They were grown for export to European markets. This dispossession of land had devastating consequences. It not only destroyed traditional farming systems and created food shortages, but also turned self-sufficient communities into a dependent rural workforce, forced to labor on the very land that was once theirs. The control of land was about controlling the means of production and ultimately controlling the people themselves. If you find this history as fascinating and important as we do, consider subscribing to African Roots. We're dedicated to uncovering the stories that have been buried and giving a voice to the real history of the continent. Click that subscribe button so you don't miss our future explorations. Now, let's talk about geography. Look at a map. Africa sits at a critical crossroads of global trade. Controlling the coastlines of Africa meant controlling the world's most important sea lanes. The Suez Canal in Egypt, for instance, cut the journey from Europe to Asia by thousands of miles. Whoever controlled that canal controlled a major artery of global commerce. The Cape of Good Hope, at the southern tip of Africa, was another vital point. Before the Suez Canal, it was the primary route to the east. Ports along the west and east African coasts became crucial refueling stations and strategic naval bases. By establishing colonies all along these routes, European powers could protect their own trade, project their naval power, and disrupt the trade of their rivals. Africa wasn't just a source of resources, it was the chessboard on which the game of global domination was played. But the looting wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. For thousands of years, Africa had been a cradle of knowledge, innovation, and art. Ancient Egypt gave the world mathematics, architecture, and medicine. The University of Timbuktu was one of the world's great centers of learning long before many European universities existed. When the colonizers arrived, they didn't just see people, they saw knowledge to be stolen and artifacts to be plundered. Thousands upon thousands of priceless cultural and historical artifacts were looted from palaces, temples, and communities. The Benin bronzes, intricate sculptures from the Kingdom of Benin, were stolen and are now scattered in museums across Europe. Sacred texts, scientific manuscripts, and royal regalia were all carted away. This was a deliberate act of cultural erasure, an attempt to strip Africa of its history and its intellectual heritage, making it easier to justify the myth of a dark continent in need of enlightenment. Finally, and perhaps most cruelly, Europe wanted Africa for its people. The raw materials and fertile lands were useless without the labor to exploit them. The transatlantic slave trade had already established a horrific precedent of treating African bodies as commodities. Even after abolition, colonialism created new systems of forced labor. Africans were compelled to work in mines, on plantations, and in the construction of colonial infrastructure like railways and roads. They were paid poverty wages, if they were paid at all, and worked in brutal, often deadly conditions. In King Leopold's Congo Free State, the quest for rubber led to a regime of such horrific violence and forced labor that millions died. This was the engine that powered the entire colonial enterprise, the exploitation of African labor to generate maximum profit for Europe. The people of Africa were the ultimate resource to be exploited. So, when we look back, the picture is clear. The scramble for Africa was never about a noble cause. It was a ruthless, calculated campaign driven by greed. It was about gold and diamonds. It was about rubber and oil. It was about controlling land and sea routes. It was about plundering knowledge and art. And it was about exploiting the labor of millions of people. These motivations didn't just shape the past. Their legacy continues to this day. The borders drawn by colonizers still fuel conflicts. The economies built on extraction still struggle to diversify. The wealth that was siphoned away has left a lasting gap. Understanding this real history isn't about assigning blame. It's about acknowledging the truth. It's the first step towards understanding the world we live in today and building a more just future. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to African Roots for more deep dives into the continent's incredible history. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.